Twin girls vanished in Rocky Ridge. 11 months later, a drone uncovers a terrifying secret. They say the woods are quiet for a reason, that the silence between the trees isn't emptiness, it's a warning. But on that morning, the silence wasn't ominous. It was peaceful, too peaceful. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the forest had already closed its mouth. What happens in the woods stays in the roots. It started like any other family trip. The Carters, Daniel, Rebecca, and their twin daughters, Aria and June, were the kind of family you'd see in a PTA newsletter photo. Reliable, kind, a little tired around the edges, like most people trying to raise kids in the digital age. The trip to Rocky Ridge was Rebecca's idea, a digital detox, she called it. Let them breathe, she'd said over coffee one morning, brushing cereal off her shirt while Aria scrolled TikTok in silence. Daniel had agreed, but more because he missed the mountains and because he missed her. They rented a cabin tucked away in the northern trails, far from cell towers, with a rickety wooden porch and a chimney that hadn't been used in years. The girls had groaned when they saw there was no Wi-Fi, but by the time the fireflies came out that first night, even June, the more restless of the two, had started collecting acorns and pointing out constellations like she'd been born under those stars. Rebecca watched them that night by the campfire, her arms wrapped around her knees, a thin blanket on her shoulders. Aria sat beside her, leaning against her hip, while June roasted a marshmallow so fiercely it burst into flames. Daniel had built a perfect pyramid of firewood and was adding kindling with a kind of quiet satisfaction that came only when a man felt useful again. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. That night, Rebecca wrote a single line in her leather-bound journal, one she hadn't touched in months. First time in a long time, it felt like we were a real family again. When they tucked the girls into their bunk beds in the corner of the cabin, June whispered something to her sister. Aria giggled. Rebecca kissed their foreheads, pulling the blanket up tight beneath their chins. "Good night, my wildflowers," she said softly, using the name she'd called them since they were toddlers. "Dream of rivers and stars." She and Daniel went to bed early, the kind of sleep that comes from hiking trails and mountain air and the relief of no buzzing notifications. And for a few hours, the cabin was still. The wind rustled gently outside, and an owl hooted in the distance. Somewhere beyond the trees, something moved, but that was normal. At least, it should have been. Daniel woke first. It was instinct, more than sound, that pulled him from sleep. A kind of unease in his chest, as if something had been undone in the night. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridgeline, but pale blue light filled the cabin. He reached over for Rebecca, still asleep, and sat up slowly, joints stiff from the wooden bed frame. It was cold. He pulled on a sweatshirt and padded toward the corner where the girls had slept. The beds were empty. At first, he didn't panic. Aria and June were explorers. They'd probably gone outside to gather pine cones or play some imaginary game. He slipped on his boots and stepped out onto the porch. The air bit at his neck. Mist curled low across the ground like something trying to hide. "Girls?" he called softly. "June? Aria?" Nothing. He tried again, louder this time. "Come on, it's early. Where are you two?" Still nothing. His heart began to race. He checked behind the cabin. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. just the forest, watching. When he came back inside, Rebecca was sitting up, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. "They're not in bed." "What?" "I've checked outside. I don't see them." Rebecca was already moving. She threw on her jacket without shoes and bolted out the door, yelling their names. Her voice cracked on the third call. They searched the area immediately around the cabin for 20 minutes. Daniel's calls grew louder. Rebecca began to scream. There were no signs, no scattered pine cones, no trail of socks, not even a bent blade of grass. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. Rebecca collapsed to her knees in the frost-damp moss. "Aria," she sobbed. "June!" When they finally called the rangers, Rebecca's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Within hours, Rocky Ridge was swarming. Dogs barked, helicopters circled, volunteers scoured the hills. Every cabin within 10 miles was alerted. Streams were searched, caves mapped, trees were marked in red tape, but the forest gave nothing back. A lone hiker came forward the next evening. He'd passed near the Carter's cabin around dawn and thought he heard laughter, high-pitched, faint, like a child's giggle. But then it was gone. He hadn't thought anything of it until the news broke. Rebecca clung to that story like a lifeline. They were laughing, she whispered to herself. If they were laughing, they weren't scared yet. Daniel didn't speak much after that. He spent his days walking the same loop around the cabin, measuring footprints with a stick he'd carved. Every mark, every fallen branch became a clue. Every shadow looked like a daughter. By week 2, the media began to fade. By week 3, the search team shrank. People called it one of the most bizarre disappearances in Rocky Ridge history. But Rebecca didn't leave. Not truly. Even when they returned to their home in Boulder for the sake of Daniel's work and her own collapsing sanity, part of her remained in that cabin, waking every night at 3:07. The exact time she'd first opened her eyes that morning to find her daughters gone. She reread their bedtime book every night. She whispered their names before bed. She lit 2 candles in the window, as if light could lead them back, and when she couldn't sleep, she scrolled. Through forums, message boards, old ranger maps, amateur drone footage, anything. Looking for something, anything that might explain what happened in that forest. But silence isn't a void. It's a choice. And the forest was still choosing. Until one day, almost a year later, a college intern testing a prototype drone picked up something strange in the trees. 2 small figures, thin, ragged, and still watching. Liam Ortega wasn't supposed to be a part of any mystery. He was just a junior at Colorado State, doing a field internship no one else had wanted. Wildlife tracking with aging tech, unpaid hours, and early mornings. His job was simple: monitor elk migration in the upper ridgelines of Rocky Ridge National Forest, test a new thermal drone provided by the department, and write a dry report about it at the end of the semester. But on that April morning, standing at the edge of a steep gulch laced with pine, Liam's life collided with something far older than routine. The drone rose with a quiet hum, blades slicing through thin mountain air. Liam adjusted the gimbal, scanning for movement across the valley. Nothing but trees. Hundreds, thousands, unmoving, unbothered. A perfect, empty still. He hovered the drone over a rock ledge known as Dead Timber Hollow, an area his supervisor had specifically told him to avoid, citing dense canopy and poor GPS reception. But Liam, in his own quiet rebellion, was curious. The name sounded made up, a place that didn't want to be found. The drone fed real-time footage to his laptop screen, every branch and shadow crisp in morning light. He scanned, bored, half watching. Then something twitched, low, tucked beneath the pines. He froze. He rolled the footage back. Two small figures, barely visible, standing still, shoulder to shoulder, in what looked like shredded clothing. They didn't move like wildlife. They didn't scatter like deer. They looked back. Liam leaned closer to the screen, heart thumping. He hit pause, zoomed. They were too far to be clear, just outlines really, but the posture, the proportions, the tangled hair. One wore a faded yellow hoodie, the other something pink. He rewound, played again, paused. Same frame, same impossible frame. For 20 straight minutes, he replayed that 5-second clip, his pulse pounding in his ears. At some point, he whispered to the screen, "No way." He opened a new tab and searched. Rocky Ridge missing twins. Dozens of articles appeared. Aria and June Carter. Last seen, May 12th. Rocky Ridge National Forest. Age 10. Identical twins. Vanished without a trace. Liam stared at the photos. Two girls with shy smiles and summer freckles. One wore a yellow hoodie, the other a pink pajama top, exactly like in the video. He scrolled deeper, search footage, vigil candles, aerial maps. After a few weeks, the coverage faded. Comments turned cynical. But the parents never gave up. Rebecca Carter still posted to a page titled "Still Looking for Our Girls." The last update was 3 days ago. If there's anyone still flying drones over the park, please check near Dead Timber Hollow. Just please. Liam didn't sleep that night. Instead, he copied the footage to a flash drive and drove an hour to the sheriff's office in Gunnison County. When he arrived, bleary-eyed and shaking, he asked to speak with someone about a missing persons case. The deputy at the desk looked up slowly. "You're about a year too late, kid." Liam didn't argue. He just opened his laptop and hit play. By the time the screen showed the paused frame, the deputy wasn't blinking. "Wait here," he said, his voice suddenly thinner. Within the hour, the footage was playing in a secure room surrounded by 3 detectives, a forest ranger, and a federal liaison who'd been pulled in from Denver 2 months earlier and had never fully unpacked his bag. Coordinates were plotted, terrain cross-checked. Liam watched silently as they hovered over every detail he'd barely understood when he first recorded it. "This area," the ranger said, pointing to the screen, "is completely off trail. No official maps, no ranger routes, just cliffs and legend." They called it Dead Timber Hollow because nothing grew there. The trees were brittle, gray, and slouched. It was the kind of place hikers took photos of but never entered. The land was steep, jagged, and shielded by a canopy so dense that even helicopters couldn't get a clear visual. No one had searched it last year. It was considered too dangerous and too far from the original disappearance site to be relevant. But now, it was the only thing that made sense. A recovery team was assembled within 48 hours. This wasn't a volunteer search anymore. These were professionals, trackers, trauma medics, tactical units trained to navigate wilderness that didn't welcome visitors. Helicopters were ruled out, too risky with the tree cover. They'd have to go in on foot, with ropes, infrared sensors, and portable drones. And before they left, one of the senior agents made a phone call to Boulder. The kind of call you don't script, because there's no good way to say what you're about to say. Rebecca Carter was folding laundry when the call came. She almost didn't answer. It was a private number, but when she did, she heard a voice she didn't recognize say her name, softly, then ask if she was sitting down. Daniel had to take the phone from her halfway through. She dropped it, hands shaking, knees buckling. They didn't tell her the girls were alive. They couldn't. All they said was, "We may have something. We're sending a car." Rebecca stared at the screen capture they showed her, a blurry frame of two figures half hidden in pine. "That's them," she whispered, eyes burning. "That's my girls." Daniel didn't speak. He just stood behind her, one hand clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time in months, there was movement behind his silence, and it terrified him. The next morning, just before dawn, the recovery team hiked in through the northern ridge. The trail narrowed quickly into shale and moss, the kind of terrain that gave under your weight and reminded you that nature didn't care about your training. The trees hung close, like watchers. Fog kissed their boots. Every branch that cracked underfoot sounded like a scream. They launched a thermal drone once they reached a ledge above the hollow. The silence down there was suffocating. At 6:17 a.m., the screen lit up with two heat signatures, roughly human-sized, stationary, tucked beneath a canopy of branches near a rock overhang. The drone hovered, adjusted, confirmed. Two figures, alive, or recently alive. The coordinates were marked. The team descended, and somewhere below, just out of reach of sunlight, something stirred. Rebecca waited in a ranger's cabin, staring out the window at a fog-choked ridgeline. She held her daughter's journal in her lap, tracing the cover with her thumb. The same line echoed through her mind, over and over again. Dream of rivers and stars. Her heart wouldn't let her believe it yet, but her bones knew. Something had survived. There are moments when time doesn't just slow, it stops entirely. When breath freezes, clocks forget to tick, and the air becomes so heavy it presses against your skin. That was the feeling the rescue team described when they found them. The descent into Dead Timber Hollow was brutal. Roots clawed at ankles, rocks shifted without warning, and every step felt like treading through a place that didn't want to be disturbed. The air was damp, filled with a smell of rot and cold stone. They moved carefully, flashlights low, voices hushed. No one spoke above a whisper. It wasn't just caution, it was instinct, as if the forest itself was listening. It was just past noon when they reached the base of the ridge. The terrain opened into a ravine, wrapped in brambles and shadow, and then, just ahead, movement, barely audible. A rustle, like leaves shifting, like someone breathing. One of the rescuers called out, soft but clear, "Hello?" There was a pause. Then a voice replied, faint, fragile. "Help!" A child's voice. They scrambled forward, lights slicing through the underbrush. And then they saw it. Beneath a makeshift shelter, no more than sticks, bark, and branches, weighed down by stone and half collapsed from weather, two small figures sat huddled together. One had her arms wrapped around the other, eyes sunken, cheeks hollow. Both were coated in dirt, skin pale, lips cracked. The older one, the one with the longer braid, blinked into the light and whispered, "I am Arya." The younger girl didn't speak. She just stared. Her name was June. The team didn't move at first. For a second, no one did. It was as if they were staring into a dream, except dreams didn't shake like that, didn't tremble when wind blew through them. "Blankets," someone muttered. "Water, glucose gel." Paramedics dropped to their knees. One took Arya's pulse. Another wrapped June in a thermal blanket and gently pressed a water pouch to her lips. The girls were severely dehydrated, malnourished, but alive. And yet, what stunned the team more than the fact they'd survived was that they seemed prepared. Not just lucky. They had shelter. A clear system of protection, like someone had shown them how. And then they found the backpack. Less than 20 feet from the girls' shelter, half buried in pine needles, its nylon surface faded from sun and frost, was a backpack no one recognized from the original missing persons inventory. Inside were canned goods, a working flashlight, a utility knife with barely any rust, each item carefully selected, just enough to sustain, just light enough to move, and sewn into the inner lining, just above the weathered seam, was a name written in black marker, R. Callan. One of the rescuers, Harris, a veteran of backcountry missions in 3 states, picked it up and stared. "This isn't theirs," he said quietly. "This is someone else's." Another voice crackled over the radio. "You're going to want to see this." About 30 yards upslope, they'd found something else. A narrow path, half overgrown, half trampled, led to a crude campsite tucked beneath a cluster of dead pine. A weather tarp hung between 2 trees. The remains of a fire ring sat at the center, ash long since cooled. And near the edge, half buried in dirt and moss, a hand-carved wooden figure. It was small, unfinished, but unmistakably shaped like a little girl with braided hair. They brought the figure down to where the girls were being stabilized. Rebecca arrived by helicopter less than an hour later. Her boots hit the ground before the rotors even stopped turning. She didn't wait for protocol, didn't ask for permission. She ran. Her knees hit the dirt next to Arya, hands trembling as she reached out to touch her daughter's cheek. "Baby," she gasped. "Baby, is it really you?" Arya looked up, blinked. Then, slowly, her arms wrapped around her mother's neck. The first sound she made was a sob so deep it seemed to come from her spine. June didn't move at first. She watched, hollow-eyed, until Rebecca turned and reached for her too. The little girl recoiled slightly, then leaned in, slowly, like a deer learning not to flinch. Rebecca held them both. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He simply dropped to the ground beside them, resting his forehead on Arya's shoulder, as if his entire body had forgotten how to be upright. But the peace of that moment, what little of it there was, didn't last long. Because when Arya was finally warm, hydrated, and able to form words again, someone asked her gently, "How did you survive?" She looked down, paused, then said softly, "We made a shelter." We found food. Who showed you how? Another asked. Her eyes flicked up. She hesitated. A man, she said. I think. What was his name? I don't remember. The medical team exchanged glances. That was when June stirred. She reached for a crayon one of the nurses had left near the edge of a clipboard, and on the back of a medical form, she began to draw a cabin, crude, slanted, hidden under trees, a man with no face, holding a flashlight, and in the sky, a small dot with blinking lights, the drone. She wrote one sentence beneath it in jagged, uneven letters. We saw it. He saw us. Later that night, after the girls were flown to St. Luke's Pediatric Trauma Center, the lead investigator sat with the Carter parents in a quiet waiting room. He slid the hand-carved wooden figure across the table. Rebecca flinched when she saw it. That's them, she whispered. There's more, the detective said. Up at the other site, a camp, food remains, fire pit. Whoever was there, he wasn't just watching. He was living close, staying hidden. Daniel asked the question no one wanted to ask out loud. Was he keeping them? Were they prisoners? The detective hesitated. They weren't starving. Someone was feeding them. Just enough. Someone who knew how to move supplies without being seen. Who knew the terrain? Then he lowered his voice. And that someone may still be out there. They all sat in silence, until Rebecca broke it with a whisper. Aria keeps saying something, she said, over and over. The detective turned toward her. She says, we weren't alone. It was somewhere around 3 a.m. when Aria screamed, a sound so raw, so sharp, it cut through the white noise hum of the hospital and dragged Rebecca out of sleep like a drowning woman gasping for air. Nurses rushed in with soft voices and steady hands, but Aria fought their touch. Her arms flailed. Her eyes were wide open, but she wasn't awake. Not fully. She's reliving it, one of the trauma nurses whispered. Rebecca pushed past them, heart pounding in her throat. Sweetheart, baby, it's me. It's Mom. Aria blinked hard, her gaze swimming back to the present. Then she collapsed into her mother's chest and sobbed. The kind of crying that came from a place far deeper than any wound. She didn't say anything for a long time, just let herself be held, small again, like she had been at 5, scared of thunderstorms. But eventually, she whispered something into Rebecca's shirt. He used to come at night. Rebecca didn't move. He wore a mask, bark and dirt and something. It smelled like smoke, like old pennies. He said we had to be quiet. If we made noise, the trees would wake up and take us away. Aria's voice faltered. He said we were lucky. That morning, investigators brought in a child trauma specialist, someone trained to sit quietly in the margins of fear and coax memory out of the silence. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Marlowe, and she didn't wear a lab coat or carry a clipboard. She wore soft gray sweaters and kept her hair tied back in a braid, like the girls. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside Aria's bed, offering crayons instead of questions. Aria didn't speak at first. She drew. Shapes, cabins, a swing made of rope, a stick figure with no eyes. Then she drew something else, a woman this time, taller than the trees, her face hidden under long strands of what looked like cloth or hair. And in her arms, children, all faceless, all silent. Who is this? Dr. Marlowe asked gently. Aria paused. She watched us, she said. She didn't come close, just watched from the trees. Did she hurt you? No. Did she speak? Only once. What did she say? She said we were chosen. Across the hallway, June sat quietly, curled under a fleece blanket, her fingers clenching the edges like they could hold her together. She hadn't spoken a full sentence since the rescue, just nods. Eye movement, the occasional shudder. But when Rebecca came in and knelt beside her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek, June finally whispered, "He wasn't the only one." Rebecca froze. "What do you mean?" "There was another man. He had a limp. He called the other one Remy." That single name changed everything. Detective Howren, lead on the case, bolted from his chair in the waiting room the moment he heard. In less than an hour, they'd found the match. A man named Remy Vassler, once listed as a maintenance worker for the Rocky Ridge Backcountry Ranger Division, terminated in 2005 for erratic behavior, officially declared dead in 2009 after his abandoned car was found beside a river in a neighboring county. Except now, they knew he hadn't died. He'd disappeared into the forest, and someone, somehow, had helped him stay hidden. When officers tracked a faint trail branching off from the original site, half game path, half camouflaged trail, they discovered something else. A half-buried hatch beneath a collapsed root system. Inside was a space no bigger than a closet, but it was insulated, soundproofed, lined with old insulation, rotted sleeping bags, and, etched into the drywall, dozens of tiny claw marks, most of them at child height, some recent. Rebecca was not told immediately, but she knew. A mother knows when something isn't just dark, it's evil. That evening, Arya asked to see the backpack again, the one that had been found near the shelter. The moment her fingers brushed it, she stiffened. "This wasn't his," she said. "Whose was it?" the therapist asked. She shook her head. "I don't know." "But it wasn't the man with the mask?" Arya was quiet. Then finally, "He didn't carry things. She did." "Who? The woman in the trees?" Back at the field office, investigators dug deeper into Callan's past. The man whose name had been on the backpack. Russell Callan, a former forest ranger, dismissed in 2011 after a mental health evaluation, flagged him as a potential threat. No charges, no formal complaints, just whispers, a sealed report. A family who'd pulled their daughter out of a youth wilderness program early, citing odd behavior from a ranger. The dots were connecting, slowly, horrifyingly. Russell Callan and Remy Vassler weren't just ghosts of the forest, they were architects. And Lena, the woman Arya kept seeing, was something else entirely, a shadow that hadn't yet been caught in the light. The next morning, a woman in her 60s arrived at the sheriff's office clutching a folded newspaper in trembling hands. Her skin was sun-creased, her eyes bloodshot. "I saw the carvings on the news," she said, voice raspy. "I've seen them before." Detective Howren leaned in. She continued, "In my attic, when I moved into a foreclosed property outside Gunnison 6 years ago, there was a trunk full of them, little statues of girls with braided hair. My husband burned them. Said they gave him nightmares." "Do you remember who lived there before you?" Howren asked. She didn't have to. The deed records did. The property was last owned by a shell company tied to Russell Callan. By noon, a team had breached the abandoned cabin, cold, decaying, but undeniably lived in at some point, in the basement, Hidden behind a wall of stacked firewood, they found a locked door, and behind that door, a soundproofed room, lined with insulation, covered in scratch marks, and in the far corner, under a stained mattress, a wooden drawer filled with warped Polaroids. The girls were in them, both of them, blank-faced, hands folded, always seated, always inside the same narrow space. In every photo, there was a shadow just behind them, not fully visible, never in focus, but always present, watching. The photos were rushed to the hospital for confirmation. Rebecca collapsed when she saw them. They were taken before the shelter, the agent explained. This was earlier, maybe the first place. But there was another, Rebecca said through tears. Aria said they moved, that they kept moving. She was right. Digital breadcrumbs began to emerge. Receipts, drone footage from wildlife enthusiasts, trail cameras once dismissed as glitches. They all pointed to the same pattern, movement, across counties, across seasons, always into terrain no one would bother to check. They weren't just hiding the girls. They were rotating them. That night, Aria mumbled something in her sleep. A whistle. One long, two short. She repeated it 3 times. Dr. Marlowe, who had begun sleeping in a cot near the girls' room, jotted it down. When compared to audio from trail cameras, it matched a pattern once dismissed as a bird call. It wasn't. It was a signal. And somewhere in the forest, someone was still listening for it. The first time, June spoke more than a whisper. It was while cartoons played silently on a hospital TV. Rebecca had stepped out for coffee, and the nurse had turned down the lights to ease the pressure behind June's eyes. Aria was asleep in the neighboring bed, her fingers curled loosely around the edge of her blanket. June stared at the screen without really watching it. Then she said, very clearly, "We weren't the first." The nurse froze. "Sweetheart, what do you mean?" "There was a boy," June continued. Her voice was soft, detached, as if the memory didn't belong to her anymore. "He had a scar on his eyebrow. He said his name was Tommy." She looked down at her hands. But one day, he wasn't there anymore. Across the hospital wing, Agent Bell stood before a wall of case files in a war room hastily assembled in an unused administrative office. He traced red thread between photos. Rocky Ridge, Gunnison, Southern Utah. 12 missing child cases over the last 8 years, all within 100 miles of the Carter's cabin. All unsolved, all young, all taken near forests, campsites, or trails that didn't lead anywhere anymore. Tommy Rivera. The name surfaced with an almost cinematic chill. 8 years old. Vanished during a family hike in New Mexico, 2018. His case had gone cold after only 3 weeks. Now, a survivor had remembered him, and that single memory shifted the entire framework of the investigation. Agent Bell made the call immediately. "Reopen Rivera. Bring in Interpol. This isn't a random abduction ring. This is a network." Meanwhile, Dr. Marlowe sat cross-legged beside June's bed. She didn't press, just listened. "There were other kids," June said, "but we weren't allowed to talk to them, only through the cracks when he wasn't watching." "Who was watching?" June hesitated. "Sometimes him, sometimes her." Yay. Rebecca entered mid-conversation, and the look on her face when she heard the word her was the same as someone stepping into cold water without warning. "You mean Lena?" she asked. June nodded slowly. She didn't hurt us, but she didn't stop him either. That evening, investigators returned to the forest, to the site where the backpack and the first shelter had been found. Not far from it, beneath an outcrop of rock, they discovered a trail, a hidden game path, partially disguised with branches, barely wide enough for a child to walk through upright. It led to an old mine shaft, collapsed, abandoned, but not forgotten. Inside, they found something no training manual had prepared them for. Dozens of wooden carvings, each about 6 inches tall, each shaped like a child, all with twin braids, some smiling, some broken, a few with tiny button eyes sewn in with old thread. And near the back, under a rotting cot, they found a small crate. Inside, handwritten notes, dozens of them. Some just scratches, spirals, madness. But one stood out. The mountains took my daughters. Now they've given me new ones. These ones stay. These ones listen. Detective Howard stared at it under the pale beam of his flashlight, his stomach hollow. Not just from horror, but from realization. They had found only 2 girls. But this person, this thing in human skin, they weren't just abducting. They were replacing it. Later that night, Arya began mumbling again. But this time, the words were different. He called me 3. 3 what, honey? Rebecca asked, brushing her hair back. He said I was number 3. June was 4. Rebecca swallowed. Did he ever say who 1 and 2 were? Arya nodded faintly. They weren't there anymore. In the same breath, back at the sheriff's office, another search team recovered a map, half buried beneath the soil near what investigators now believed was the rotating shelter. It was hand-drawn, marked in red ink. 6 dots. 5 had names scratched out. 2 remained, Arya and June. Underneath, a line was scrawled in different handwriting. Only 2 left. Then I go. When Rebecca was shown the map, she went very still. I think it's a ritual, she whispered. Not religion, not even delusion, just a pattern, a cycle. Agent Bell wasn't sure he believed in such things until he saw what came next. At 2:43 a.m., a government-issued surveillance drone detected heat signatures moving through the edge of Ridgeline Gulch, an area considered unreachable due to landslides. 7 figures. 6 were small, close together, moving slow. 1 stood apart, tall, still. She was wrapped in cloth, her face hidden beneath layers. She stood perfectly still as the drone hovered. Then she turned and smiled. It wasn't a trick of the lens. It wasn't interference. It was deliberate. She had seen it, and she wasn't afraid. Back at the hospital, June had started drawing again. She drew the cave, the cold place, the quiet place. She called it the waiting house. In her drawing, a group of children sat inside. Some had red X's over their mouths. One sat alone in the corner, her hair in a single braid, her eyes big and round. Rebecca recognized the necklace. It was the one she'd given June on her 7th birthday. But this wasn't June. This was someone else. She flipped the page. A figure, taller than the others, loomed outside the cave, hands outstretched, hair trailing like vines. In one hand, a rope. In the other, a bell. Why the bell? Dr. Marlowe asked gently. June didn't look up. She rings it when it's time. When it's time for what? June was quiet for a long time. Then she said, to decide who leaves. At that same moment, agents recovered a small trunk from the mine site. It was filled with old ID tags, camp badges, a child's shoe, a necklace that didn't belong to either of the Carter girls, with Beth etched into the back. Beth Holloway, age 11, vanished on a school camping trip in Montana. 12 years ago. Her file had long been closed, but she had been here. They all had. This wasn't a miracle rescue. It was an interruption, a break in the rhythm of something far more organized, far more ancient. Arya, still groggy from sedation, whispered to her nurse as she drifted to sleep. She said the forest chooses. Rebecca sat in the chair between both girls' beds, her hands folded, her spine straight, her face pale. What if this wasn't about taking? She asked Dr. Marlowe. What if it was about keeping? The doctor didn't answer, because she didn't know how. And deep in the forest, just beyond the reach of roads and search teams and satellites, something was still watching. By the time they found the final shelter, the trail had all but vanished. The forest had closed in again, branches curling like fingers, moss reclaiming footsteps, wind moving in strange patterns, as if trying to erase what didn't belong. But it was there, just enough to follow. Lily had remembered something. It wasn't a real house, she said, her eyes cloudy. It was made to look like it belonged, but it didn't. Guided by her description and enhanced drone footage, the search team pressed deeper into terrain so rugged it wasn't even classified. No trails, no human marks, only a faint overhang of stone pressed into the mountain's ribs. There, half buried beneath brush and years of fallen pine, was a structure, an old trapper's cabin. At first glance, it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood was gray with age, the chimney bent and rusted. But when Agent Alvarez peered through a crack in the side wall, he saw it. Fresh footprints in the dirt floor, a tin cup, a canvas sack, and inside, covering the walls like wallpaper, were drawings, hundreds of them. Children, always children, some smiling, some asleep, some crying, none with names, all with braids. Alvarez motioned for silence. The team circled. The front door was chained shut, but around the back, a partial opening had been wedged under a rotting beam. The air inside was thick, stale, like something had been left too long and forgotten, or remembered too well. One officer stepped through the opening and nearly gagged. The smell was a mix of mildew, old metal, and something faintly sweet, like decay that had learned to disguise itself. They moved slowly, documenting everything: blankets on the floor, empty food pouches, a kerosene lamp still full, a crude fireplace made of stone and ash, and then, beneath the stairs, a crawl space, just big enough for one adult to lie down. Folded under old rags, wrapped in something that looked like animal hide, was a leather-bound notebook. Alvarez opened it. The first page was written in looping, deliberate script. 2 little birds, mine to keep. No one knows. No one speaks. Each page after that descended into obsession. They came to me. The forest gave them. Oh, I kept them warm. 6 in all. 2 are still mine. And then, the final entry. One wandered too far. I followed. The others will come. I'm not done. Alvarez snapped the book shut. He's not here, he said, voice tight. But he was, recently. Outside, fresh footprints confirmed it. One set, adult-sized, left heel dragging slightly, a limp. They led uphill, toward the ridge, toward nowhere. Move now, Alvarez ordered. No sirens, no comms. The team split. Half stayed behind to secure the scene. The others followed the trail. Each step was slower than the last. The elevation rose, the air thinned. One officer slipped on loose shale and tumbled before catching herself. But the prints continued. And then, movement. Just ahead, between the trees. A hunched figure, tall, lean, limping. Alvarez called out, "Federal agents! Stop where you are!" The man looked over his shoulder, then bolted. The chase was chaos, branches snapping, radios crackling, boots pounding. The man moved fast despite his limp, weaving like a shadow. But Alvarez knew the terrain better. He cut low, through a switchback trail, and intercepted him just as the figure broke from the trees. They collided, hard. The man hit the ground, and officers swarmed seconds later. He didn't fight, didn't scream. He just smiled. His beard was patchy, his eyes bloodshot. His clothes layered in cloth and leather, like armor made from time. They pulled a folding knife from his coat. Alvarez looked into his eyes. "What's your name?" The man didn't blink. "Henry Vassler," he said calmly, "but I don't think that matters anymore." Back at the hospital, Rebecca sat with Aria and June as medical staff performed one final series of scans. The girls were stable, healing, but not whole. Neither of them had asked to go home. That worried Rebecca most. She asked them softly, "What are you thinking about?" June answered first, voice small. "The quiet," Aria followed. "She's still out there, watching." Rebecca tried not to react, tried not to let the chill run up her arms, because even after Vassler's capture, after the cabin, the notebook, the trail, there was still one name neither girl had stopped whispering. Lena. And no one had found her. Not yet. Inside the interview room, Vassler sat in a metal chair, wrists bound, expression blank. Detective Marlowe entered with Agent Bell. They didn't waste time. "These girls," Marlowe said, sliding 2 photos across the table. "Did you take them?" Vassler looked down. "I helped them," he said. "You expect us to believe that?" Bell asked. "You fed them, taught them to survive, left them alone in the woods for months?" "I didn't leave them," Vassler replied. "She did." "Lena?" He nodded. "She finds them. I only helped the ones she was done with." "What does that mean?" Marlowe snapped. "Done with how?" Vassler leaned back, the smile fading from his face. "She doesn't keep them forever, only until they know how to listen." Bell stood abruptly. "You're going away for the rest of your life." Vassler looked past him, through the mirrored glass, towards something no one else could see. "You still don't get it," he whispered. "She never takes the ones you're looking for, only the ones no one misses." 3 days later, a new drone pass over a northern sector of the ridge picked up fresh heat signatures. 7 again. 6 small. 1 tall. But by the time the tactical team arrived, they were gone. Only one trace remained, a set of small footprints in a circle. In the center, a burned patch of moss. and a symbol etched into a nearby rock with charcoal. A circle, 6 lines, one of them crossed out. Back at the hospital, Arya had a nightmare. She screamed, "She's picking again!" When asked who, she whispered, "The woman who smells like trees." Rebecca held her through it. Hours later, she asked, "Do you think we'll ever find her?" Arya didn't answer. Instead, she asked, "Do you think she thinks she saved us?" Rebecca was quiet. Then finally, "I think people who hurt others tell themselves that, so they can sleep." Arya looked away. Then she must sleep very well. On the last night before discharge, June crawled into Arya's bed without a word. They curled together under the same blanket, just like they had in the shelter. Rebecca stood in the doorway and watched them breathe. A nurse approached quietly. "You should sleep too," she said. Rebecca didn't move. Not yet. Because even now, even with them home, with the story reaching its end, Rebecca knew something the headlines wouldn't say. This wasn't about closure. This was about warning. Somewhere out there, the forest still whispered. Somewhere out there, someone still listened. And somewhere, on a map not yet discovered, another circle was being drawn.